The immature male will always make a big deal about being kind to animals and children and whales and other living things and not a threat, not in any way a violent person or even capable of being a violent person and not being a threat. Look out for that kind of person, because the shadow is very sadistic in that kind of person. See? Because, in other words, just because they do not show a sword does not mean they don't have a blade.
Welcome to the second lecture in a series on the warrior archetype within men's psychology by Dr. Robert Moore. In this talk, Dr. Moore will focus on the warrior and its relationship to masculine creativity and leadership. He'll explore the symbolism of the sword, representing masculine potency, honor, and the responsible use of power. The importance of a strong father figure in masculine initiation is also discussed. So join us as Dr. Robert Moore goes deep into the structures of the warrior archetype within the male psyche, revealing its positive and negative sides that influence the lives of each and every man.
Pleased with all the cultural examples that I wanted to give you. And I'd like to finish that as quickly as I can tonight, and then we'll turn to our scheduled topic for the evening, which is looking at the potential of this archetypal structure, the archetype of the warrior. And let me just review quickly with you the assumptions that we're operating on with regard to archetypal psychology and the relationship between ego and archetype. Remember, I said last week that properly to understand any archetype is to understand that the thing is really very imperialistic. It does not respect boundaries. Archetypes don't respect persons. They really sort of have contempt for humans, basically. The Greeks used to talk about the gods and their sort of snide attitudes toward humans. Well, that's consistent with what we talk about in terms of archetypes. But remember, archetypes don't regulate themselves. They organize psychology and behavior. And they do it when not confronted with a pretty strong ego. They do it compulsively. They will compel certain patterns of behavior. And so, you got in the psyche, you've got so many different archetypes. I mean, you can do it in terms of the gods and goddesses in every woman in the way that Jean Boleyn does, and she was here Friday. I hope some of you got to hear her lecture from Dionysius. Or you can cut it the way I cut it, which is in terms of the different kinds of partners in the psyche, male and female, and I divided, as I told you last week, into king and queen, a pair of male and female warriors, male and female magicians, male and female lovers. And given that, you got to be clear that without a strong ego development in the psyche, or what the Cohoutians would call a strong, cohesive self-organization, with a little s, the arrangements of these archetypal configurations and patterns in any person's psyche will be compulsive and very rigid. And so to do your thorough archetypal psychology, you have to kind of get a sense about what the dominants in a particular personality are, get a sense about why that is, and what would need to happen if they were to individuate, that is, to gain some sense of freedom from compulsion by the archetypal structures. And so that's what your goal is. Your goal is to develop an ego self, or ego archetypal self, I prefer to say for purposes of clarity, an ego archetypal self axis in which you are not compelled by any of these things, in which you can access them and be inspired and empowered by these things as is needed or appropriate in what you're facing in life. Hopefully accessing them consciously as much as possible and as non-compulsively as possible. Now, next week, we're going to go a lot into pathology, particularly around the pathology related to this archetype. And I'm going to get into things like the so-called active independent personality, sociopath, borderlines, obsessive compulsive personality types, passive aggressive personality types, so forth and so on, to try to kind of show the way in which this thing manifests when it's either accessed compulsively or not accessed directly enough. And we'll talk some about domestic violence and things like that in this context. But tonight I just want to go through some more of this mythological background just as briefly as I can, and then I want to turn to the positive side of this thing. What's it for? What is it there to enable? And try to keep us focused on that. So I say all this to say, when I'm talking tonight about all the wonderful things about this archetype, I want you to keep in mind all these other things I've said and the fact that we're going to talk about the pathology next week, because I'm not going to emphasize a lot about the pathology tonight. Okay, now I didn't get to the mysteries of the sword that are so big in human history. And I want to spend a little time on that. And then I want to talk a little bit about initiation of the warrior. And one of the kind of ways in which this is presented, particularly in Western mythology. And then we'll turn to looking at some of the virtues. First of all, everybody in these circles has heard of Excalibur. One of the things, I forgot to give you all your film assignments last week, but one of them, I gave you some, but there were some others I didn't mention. I didn't really mention Excalibur as a film that would be good for you to see in this context. Because if you see Excalibur, the movie Excalibur, you have a lot of these masculine archetypes really laid out there, sketched very prominently. And you get a very powerful sort of mythic representation of all this stuff about the sword Excalibur. And so let's get this thing about Excalibur out and get the salient aspects of the mythology of Excalibur out on the table where we can see it. So let's just, tell us the important things to know about Excalibur. Just jump in, have the courage to be imperfect, and tell us. Well, in some versions. That's right. And of course, Jungians would have fun with that. Coming out of the lake, oh yeah.
Only one person could pull it out of the rock.
Right. Now we need to stay with this thing about that whole image a moment. But go ahead, somebody else has.
And also true that only the true owner of it got to make work, and when he works, it's some.
Yeah, all this stuff about the only the right person. And we need to think about what this right person business is. Can draw this thing from the stone. The thing, of course, is that the sword is in the stone, and there's a prophecy about the person that can pull this from the stone becoming king. And, of course, there is this thing about the sword singing. And, of course, you really get a lot of elaboration of this mythology in Star Wars. I mean, you got to think about the whole Star Wars cycle as picking up a lot of these mythological motifs, and particularly this thing about the sword. And remember, in Star Wars, the thing sings. I mean, it has a mind of its own. I mean, it does its thing. It has a mind of its own. The light, of course, then that's really, boy, they're really hitting us with a double whammy with that. The light sword. Later on tonight, when we're talking about the thing that this is representing, the whole thing about discrimination, the capacity for discrimination, to put it delicately, to cut the Gordian knot, the capacity to cut the Gordian knot. Or to put it less delicately, to be able to cut through a lot of bullshit. If you do what?
So it also enables the transformation of the boy into manhood.
Precisely. Now, one of the things that we joke a lot about, these men and all their preoccupation with their organ, But there's no way to deal with masculine psychology without doing a psychology of the phallus and a archetypal psychology of the phallus and all that it represents. We have still, even after the recent very good work that's been done on this, we still are very primitive on this, and we've got to look back through the history of symbolism to get some sense about the enormity of the way in which this imagery of the phallus dominates masculine psychology, and it can be no other way. That's the way it is. So what we do, we look at this. I just want to show you for a minute. With the king archetype, you get the scepter. See? Often with the orb on it. See? With the magus, what do you get? The wand. You get the wand, or often you'll get the staff of Moses, see, which is a wand. And so you get a wand. Of course, with the warrior, you have the sword.
So how about the others?
And you get the embodiment. You get the lingam, the real thing. Well, it's not. No. See, that's a Freudian view. That's not the real thing. That's one expression of the real thing. See, Freud was a literalist. Freud never had a theory of symbolism. And all those people that try to make Freud into having a theory of symbolism simply don't know anything about symbolism. I mean, Paul Ricoeur tried to turn Freud into Jung in his book Freud and Philosophy. It doesn't wash. But anyway, so we have the real thing here, with the great lingam. And if you go to India, you get all of this frank celebration of the great god Shiva through the archetype of phallus, but it is not just a penis. You know, some of these guys today, like this ethicist James Nelson in Minneapolis, he's going around a lot talking about men need to learn that it's not really a phallus that they have, it's a penis. And the significant thing about masculine psychology is that it's soft. All right? That's not looking at the archetypal psychology of the masculine, because the celebration of the flaccid penis does not get at the archetypal psychology of the masculine. You know, and so in other words, with each archetype of the masculine, you get a phallic representation that is never the penis. Never penis. In fact, the real truth about men's difficulty with potency is not that they think their penis has to be a phallus. A dagger, some people put it, who don't know anything at all about masculine psychology. Penis is a dagger. What they have most trouble with is not understanding that phallus is an imaginal representation of a psychological and emotional reality that exists in the imaginal realm. Yes. It exists in the psychic realm. It's psychoid. It exists in the imaginal realm. Potency is not something which is mechanical. When one gains potency as a man through initiatory processes, see, one gains potency as a man by getting some sense about what it is to be filled up with this kind of archetypal energy. And the problem with a lot of sex therapies today, they approach masculinity and masculine sexual dysfunction as a mechanical problem. It's never, except for very rare cases of, cases where people are on medications that make them impotent and so forth. Yeah.
In the realm of American blues mythology, there's the expression, it's not the meat, it's the motion.
It's not the meat, it's the motion. Yeah, the energy. See, I mean that's a sense for the kind of connectedness. The Hindus would say it's being connected to Shiva. If you're connected with Shiva, you're going to be potent. If you're not, you won't be. No, even if you can have an erection, there won't be potency. So anyway, you need to get a sense for the way in which all of these masculine archetypes have these expressions, these phallic expressions. But like Eugene Monich has said, phallus is not penis. See? It can't be reduced to that. Okay, so anyway, yeah. Yes. Well, in this context, one has to understand that in terms of the psyche, you're talking about what that represents. What is the reality that this presents? And the reality is everything that is represented in the god Shiva in Hinduism. It is tremendous creative energy, boundless movement, and so forth and so on, and centeredness, all these things that we'll talk about more in a minute. But let's go back to Excalibur. See, all I'm doing this for is to show you that, see, the mythology of Excalibur and all the sword fantasies that males have had throughout history, they take their place in this whole phallic symbolic representation that men are into from very early ages to when they're elderly. They never get out of this. So we wait around till men get out of this, you're going to wait a long time. Now, let's go back to Excalibur. What else can you tell me about Excalibur now? Big stone.
It's in the lake.
Okay.
It cannot be retrieved until the second coming of birth.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, when the thing is misused, when you are not worthy of it, it goes, disappears. There's something transpersonal that disarms you, in effect. Now, archetypally speaking, we talk about the function of the trickster here. The trickster archetype will get you if you misuse any form of psychological power. You're riding for a fall, because the trickster is going to be constellated. It's one way of saying it. Or another way of saying it is you're going to constellate your nemesis. Hubris will constellate a nemesis, which will come and disarm you. Look at hubris, pride, arrogance, will constellate a force which will come and challenge you and disarm you. And so that whole motif about the sword going back in the lake is about that. It's about this idea that just because you have gotten the sword out of the stone, don't assume you can keep it. See? It would be one way to talk about that would be the shadow. But I wouldn't want that to get the connotation that this is merely personal shadow. That is to say, the nemesis is that law of opposites, that that coincidentia oppositorum, that idea that there is an enantiodromia, there is a reversal. When you get into exaggeration, you're likely to run into the opposite. And so, but it's a kind of an inner critique of power. And you can see this in history a lot. For example, you look at the cycle which led from the bombing of Pearl Harbor to the bombing of Tokyo, for example. And the same thing you can do on the Nazi invasions and so forth. They constellated a lot of forces that were going to disempower them and have that purpose. I mean, you see this in many, many, many kinds of places. But you also see it in terms of behavior of tyrants. Tyrants always live in fear because they know that they are going to have somebody that's going to be involved in intrigue against them, see. So there's this enantiodromia that happens. But let's meditate a little bit on that thing about being in the stone. Now, we use the water imagery, but what is this stone imagery? The sword in the stone. Why that? What would you say about that? The sword is in the stone, and it is difficult to retrieve. Now, what would you say? Say some more about that. Yes.
I would say that the stone is a vacuum thing, and that the male has to separate himself from his mother and away from feminine influences, at least to achieve any kind of use of it. Because as long as it's in the skull, it can't be used. It's got to make that separation.
If you understand that not in some genital way, if you understand it not in a genital way, that would be accurate. In terms of psychoanalytic developmental psychology, we would say that to the extent that a man is still embedded in the mother, this is not genital in any sense. It's a symbiotic fusion, merger that still exists. It's really pre-personal, and there is you can think about it, for those of you that are not really psychologically oriented that much, you can think about it as a kind of a psychological Siamese twins with the mother. One doesn't know at a deep level where she stops and I start. See, it's like we're sort of grown together at the unconscious level. And this means that I may have a tremendously elevated view of myself. This is just puer psychology. You know puer aeternus? Well, you know, Jungians love to talk puer aeternus. You know, it sounds so nice. Puer aeternus, you know. But it really is boy psychology, and boy psychology is behind all the torture in the world, all of the rape, all of the sexual violence, all of the gratuitous oppression, in terms of, I mean, some of the girl psychology gets in on this, but boy psychology is very important in it. And it's not puer aeternus, oh, how idealistic, how wonderful the puer. Well, that's a little Jungian romanticism. Puer psychology is not pretty. It's not even all that idealistic. It's really quite narcissistic is what it is, yes.
So picture that fellow that they killed at Bar.
Yeah.
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 Classic puer.
Classic puer. And see, that's what you got to see. See, puers, God knows all of us men have got a lot of it in us. So, you know, I'm not putting stones here. But to the extent that one remains a puer, one is very narcissistic and cannot love. And in the context of what this gentleman was pointing out to us, is embedded, quote, in the mother, but in order to be fair to mothers, let's understand, this is not mother. This is the mother. This is the great mother. This is the, body of the universe. I mean, it is not mom. Now, the boy may feel like it's mom, but to the extent that a son has not demythologized his mom, see, she will be a goddess. Yes.
What would you say that raises kind of like a Peter Pan syndrome just in form?
What would he say?
Yeah, how would you explain it? Developmental.
Well, he talks about it, you know, in his traditional view. He talks about it as being a failure of a natural developmental process. You know, you look at Neumann's thing. Neumann has a book on this whole process, and it just to him, it's very similar to Freud. It's a fixation of a process that should go on, but the person gets arrested. Well, Jung wasn't all that great at talking about all the plumbing on this at that time. I think there's been a lot better work done recently in terms of his failure of masculine initiation, which is what we need to talk about in a minute. But there's a lot of agreement among depth psychologists and psychoanalytic theorists now about the importance of the role of father in this. If father is not there, and if father is not very assertive in moving in and claiming a son, then the mother is going to be put in a very bad position, because she's going to be left with this experience the son will experience her as all this tremendous power, and the son may hate her guts. Not for any fault of her own, but because the father has not come in and drawn the son into his orbit of emotional functioning. And so, in effect, the son has not got the connection with the masculine that he needs in order to come away from the mother without having to try to kill her. All this discussion of, well, you got to kill the mother, all that stuff that you often hear about what you got to do to. Well, if you have an absent or weak or abusive father, you may end up into killing mother fantasies. I think a lot of these men that are very violent and hate women and kill them are men who have been really failed by the men in their lives. So
you're saying that this is projected anger on the mother when it's really rightly for the father?
Well, see, it's like the mother's never experienced as a human being there by the son. As long as the son is in the mother with a capital M, she is super powerful. Like you will find men that even in their middle age find mother such an incredibly formidable creature. They cannot relate to her as a human. They relate to her as somebody who has enormous power over them. It's very common among aging puers. But it's not the woman's fault. And it's not really the son's fault. Because it's the father's fault, or the uncle, or the grandfather. It's men's fault. Because, it's got to be, and that's one of the things we'll have to talk about healing this stuff. See, that's what our last session, we'll talk a lot about this stuff, because men have to reach in there, not blame the woman. The man has to reach in there, especially when the boy gets about puberty. And he's got to take that boy under his arm, up against him, where the boy can smell of him. Boy needs to be able to smell a dad. And he's got to be able to get up so close to dad that that's just what Kohut doesn't talk about this as a sexual thing, unless you look close, and it is. This idealization and merger that Kohut talks about. Who is it usually? It's dad. We're talking about dad here. The idealization and merger is normally with dad. And it's especially important with son. Well, if your father isn't there, it's awfully hard to idealize and merge with him. You can idealize with him, but you can't merge with him. If you just idealize him, you can't merge with him, it doesn't work. Right? If he is weak, and you can see that, and he gets humiliated in the family for everybody to see and feel embarrassed and ashamed of him. For example, dad is driving the car to town, and he hasn't driven the car to town, this particular big town, before. And in the car, the kids are there, And father is being berated because he's not getting around too well in Chicago or Detroit or wherever it is. And he's being humiliated. And the son is hearing this humiliation of the father. And the father is unable to protect himself from this. It is very damaging to the psyche of a prepubescent or pubescent boy to hear this kind of thing. It's a terrible wound because then it ruins the idealization. See, dad has to be able to be idealized in some way. You know, a lot of dads don't know about this. They don't understand. And they get shame and embarrassed. They get, you know, son is so proud of him, you know. Dad, I'm so proud of you. What did you do in the war? Oh, wow, I know you must have been a general. You know, you must have been Rambo 3 or 4 or something. No, I peel potatoes in Peoria, you know. I mean, you know. Fathers need to make like G.I. Joe at that age when the son is needing that. Yeah, I was great, son. Yeah, you know, they can find out the other later, you know, when they don't need you to be G.I. Joe. Yeah.
But what if the father remains bigger than life? Like he's still in power?
It's fine as long as the father can let the son snuggle up close and kind of say, yeah, you're my son in whom I am well pleased. You're a chip off the old block. But you see, if he's bigger than life, but he doesn't allow merger, which is what a lot of these dudes do. You know, I'm ashamed of you, you little fruit, you know. Yes, look at the great Santini. You see, you get a very adequate male in some senses of that word, but he is so much of a puer, he doesn't know it. A lot of these drill sergeant types are puers to the core, but they don't know it. See? But anyway, so the boy comes up, and I remember there's one person I think about, his father, you know. The kid was real thin, and he wasn't real muscular, and his father was a big macho man, you know. And the child would come in, he was about 12 or 13, and the father would say, you little faggot, get away from me, you little faggot. The boy wasn't homosexual. But the father just could not stand this boy's gawkiness, his awkwardness, you know. He couldn't stand the fact that he was shy. He couldn't stand the fact that he wanted to come in there and the fumble things. He couldn't handle tools well. And so the father was constantly brutalizing him, verbally. Later on, this guy turned out to be a 6'4", tremendously handsome, powerful man. Very successful New York artist now. But did he have a lot to overcome? I mean, this negative, this what I call the shadow king business in the father. But this business about being able to get up to and merge, see, get up to idealize and merge is so important. And that fails so much of the time. And we'll go into that a lot more when we talk the last session about healing this, because what you got to do, this is a little preview here, right? If you never had your masculinity mirrored by mom, for example, and you never were allowed to idealize and merge with a powerful male who was there and not abusive, then you got wounds in this thing. And you got to find ways to heal that. Got to find ways to do that. And there are a bunch of ways you can work on that. And we'll really try to get into that a lot. But back to the stone. See, this was a long way around about stone. But I meant to make it very clear that this is not a vagina. You can view it as the mother if you understand you're talking about the great mother. And one's merger with this undifferentiated matrix. But you got to understand that's unconsciousness. And that as long as that sword is in that stone, you really don't have it. You really do not have access to this thing. It is in this, and you do not feel that you have permission to have it. Men have an enormous problem with this. Even relatively healthy men have a terrible time feeling that they have a right to take the sword out of the stone. See, so they say, I'm not the right man. No sense in my trying this. I'm not the right man. No sense in my trying to pull it out. Yeah.
So then actually, taking the stone, or the sword from the stone and separation from the femininity is actually the first lesson of a long series of trials for the male in claiming his own name.
I would think that, we got to get some sense about what it takes to be able to even try it. Because there's so much guilt associated with having a sword. I mean, there are a lot of folks today, a lot of folks today that really say, you had a sword, you could hurt somebody. Yes.
I had an experience having gone to that lecture on private match. And so as she was talking about the Dionysian thing,
Yeah.
and I was identifying strongly with who he is and how he is and the impact I had on some people.
Yeah.
But with guilt and with denial and not total flow, it's like an almost.
Yes.
And just going through that lecture helped me pull that part of my sword,
Yeah.
To be the Dionysian person, that I can be for people.
Yeah. See, what she talked about is the Dionysius and all. I would talk about that in its positive sense as the mature lover. See, when a person has got the mature lover, they've got the good side of the Dionysian thing without the psychosis. See, and you don't and
Dionysius is just laying there stone.
your puer Dionysius is really a problem, as she put it to himself. See, it's really also a mark of this sense of being overwhelmed by the power. See, premature ejaculation. I'm going to talk about that some. Remind me to talk about that next week. Because, well, I will talk about it a little bit, but I want to come back to it a lot. No, I think that it's important to see this as a problem that men have in wide areas, not just a genital issue at all. And it has to do with this problem of fear of the power. Because the power, when experienced, fragments the personality. I often like to tell you, it's like a Maserati with bad engine mounts.
Actually, it's a function of you, but never found that over.
Well, that's interesting. See, it's an interesting thought, and it would fit the sense of not feeling comfortable with the power. And what you got to get a sense of is the way in which power will fragment the personality or fragment the ego structure if the individual has not developed and consolidated the capacity to channel this sort of thing appropriately. And that's what this whole, a lot about the mythology of the sword is. That's sword, wand, all of it is about that. Channeling the power appropriately so that it's not lost or squandered or in some other way malfunctioning. Okay.
like some of the young athletes that get all this fame and money and power, and some of them at least just seem to tear them apart.
Yeah, I mean, it's the staying power with success is another way this works. That is to say, being fragmented by proximity to this kind of energy and power. It's a real problem with creative people. If you're not a creative person, it's not a problem. But if you're a creative person, it's very difficult to be able to regulate the relationship with the creative energy without it making you crazy. And you see a lot of people that burn very brightly for a short period, and then they go out, either in a bang or a whimper. They go out. See? Yeah.
Considering that the legends seem like a lot of them have swords, drink water, fight nerving ones, so on and so forth, and a lot of them have swords in stone.
Yes.
We make some generalities, like, could I say something like, the stone is where the individual's power, instrumentality, whatever, is lost in a male contact of some kind, whereas in the lake stuff, it's a feminine contact where it's still lost, it's still in the mother bond stuff.
Well, you know, I don't know if you'd want to get that definite about the interpretation of symbolism. You could argue that. You can play. It's a lot of fun to play with that. I don't know that I would kind of put that down in my archetypal interpretation book as the way to interpret stone or lake. But the clear thing is that it's not accessible, and that it is in some way unconscious, and you do not have access to it, and the capacity to deal with the guilt of approaching it and having access to it is a very important thing. There has to be some sense of rightness, and you talked about permission. Have some sense of permission. Well, one of the things that masculine initiation hopefully does is to offer something about that permission to be powerful. Freudians talk about the Oedipal father, who is sort of jealous of the son's increasing power. See, but you can talk about a father who is pleased with the increasing power of the son, and that's the kind of thing that so many men have never experienced. Okay, anyway, so you can do a lot with this whole thing about drawing the sword from the stone. I think it important, for example, to think about the difference that has often been made in folklore and in literature about the difference between the kind of man that carries a dagger and the kind of a man that carries a sword. So, what is the kind of rap on that you've heard? Yes.
Dagger is someone who's usually deceitful and seeking untrustworthy, whereas the opposite sword is someone who thought they're approaches of age. Where I am, deal with this or drop away from one or the other.
That's right.
Stabbing the back.
That's right. It's hidden. It's concealed. See, the idea of the dagger is an ideal of concealment. It is an image of passive aggression. We get into that a lot more. It is the approach to masculinity which tries to communicate the message, I'm not a threat. I'm not powerful. I'm not a threat. I'm not dangerous. See? And this is typical puer psychology. The immature male will always make a big deal about being kind to animals and children and whales and other living things and not a threat, not in any way a violent person or even capable of being a violent person and not being a threat. look out for that kind of person. Because the shadow's very sadistic in that kind of person. See? Because, in other words, just because they do not show a sword does not mean they don't have a blade. In fact, if they don't show a sword, there's a dagger somewhere. Jan Cassius has a mean, lean, and hungry look. See? And so a great deal can be made about wearing the sword, as you say. I think you've got the point, Nolan. I mean, the idea that the man wears the sword out where you can see it.
Which did a lot for American mythology and 6-shooting all the West.
Yeah, I think so. See, there's a lot that goes with this stuff that doesn't, it's not very well understood. I think that there's a statement, and you see this a lot in the principles of knighthood and the principles of samurai, all sorts of things about acknowledgement of the power of the other and their stewardship of this power. The whole ceremony surrounding swords in the military life of the pre-modern era was related to this. Interestingly enough, there are Japanese firms now that are touring all over America. And guess what they're buying?
Yeah, war surplus, I mean, souvenirs.
Japanese sword. But you see,
Lots more money than humans ever thought they could get.
exactly. But you see, if you understand this sword symbolism, there's a lot more going on here than buying up World War II trinkets. Because the sword in the life of the Japanese samurai class was a spiritual reality, a masculine reality, an expression of masculine potency and honor. To have your sword taken away is an incredible humiliation. And they're buying back their heritage, and their heritage is a samurai heritage. And so look out. When all those swords get back to Japan, it's going to be real interesting.
The ultimate samurai didn't even take your sword and shove it up your shelf.
No, that's a failed samurai. A failed samurai. A shamed samurai. A samurai who's broken his pledge.
So he sticks it back in the stone, so to speak.
Well, he in effect, he honors the sword, though. I mean, in effect, he is living by the sword. See, for a knight, we'll get into this now. Samurai is just a knight. There's no way to understand the archetypal warrior without understanding chivalry and the knight. Because modern professional warriors are not warriors in the sense that they've always been in human history. And so you really have to study knighthood and all of that ceremonial and ritual and mythology around it. And it had to do with submitting yourself to the sword. The sword was a transpersonal commitment. Why is it that when you become a knight, the sword, you're dubbed with the sword. You come underneath the sword. You submit to the sword. The sword is an emblem of the responsibility of a mature male. See? It is a kind of baptism, equally as sacred. In fact, a lot more sacred than most people take baptism.
Was there also a transference of power from the king as embodied as the father, the father?
Yes.
Passing on his
Yes. And he's passing that potency through an emblem of potency. See, one emblem of potency. The king is an emblem of potency, is potency. And there is a passing on. It could well be a wand. But in this case, in terms of the particular purpose, see, in the particular purpose, it is the power of the mature man in terms of life and death, responsibility for life and death. And this whole thing that you see in gangs, for example, now, you know, in many of these street gangs, you're not an adult, see, until you have killed for the gang. That is a sort of vestige of this kind of intuition. It has to do with submitting to the power of life and death, but it is not a personal thing in the sense of an ego thing. For example, the idea of a soldier being in the military for a career is totally foreign to this. Now, I'm going to go into this for a career, and I'm going to get to be a general. Whoop-de-doo, you know. And that's a puer general, see. Because it's totally alienated from this whole, you know, they talked about that with the Civil War in the United States, technology changed so much that this whole old ancient knighthood kind of understanding of war got zapped, you know, with the revolution in muskets and all sorts of things like that. There's a big change right there, and it really got consolidated with World War I and machine gun.
Depersonalize the conflict between knights.
Yes, there was no honor then. See, a conflict between knights, you still got that sort of thing. There were still vestiges of that between some of the, for example, the Nazi, the Air Force and the Luftwaffe. There were a number of those old Prussian people that were among part of the old Prussian families who still had some of those old Prussian knighthood traditions. And these pilots, there were a lot of stories about these pilots. For example, not strafing the parachutes of flyers that they had downed. But the ones that were thoroughly modern Nazis, of course, had no hesitation to attack people that were defenseless. See, the old knighthood ideals would never use power against those that were, you know, defenseless, you know, helpless and defenseless, and that's all that romance about the lady, protecting the lady, and all of that stuff is a part of this whole configuration that you got to get some sense for. The knighthood ideal is controlling one's own egoistic desires and drives. The use of power, particularly the potential power of violence, in the service of the realm and in service of the right order of the king. And so this whole thing about the sword being out, you have to understand, it's out there. It is acknowledged. There is a code that rules it, and nowhere do you see this more highly developed than in Japan. In the what is known as the way of the sword, Kendo, Kendo, or any of you specialists in Kendo. There are a lot of Kendo people here in Chicago. There, you know, in Kendo, it's a martial art like the other martial arts, and you know, work your way up and become a black belt, and this type of thing. And the whole thing is a whole entirely comprehensive spirituality of the sword. Very much like Zen, very much influenced by Zen. And the whole idea about the Kendo master is that one becomes such a master of the sword and that one dedicates himself to the sword, but the sword is dedicated to justice. And the sword is dedicated to the triumph over egoism. And for the Kendo master, the greatest enemy is his own, what you and I would call narcissism. They say ego. That the sword, the first enemy of the sword is the ego. And there are many teaching stories, Kendo teaching stories, in which and you see this played time and again in the movies. If you know what you're looking for, you see this same archetypal motif in the stories of the old gunfighter and the young gunfighter. But you see these Kendo teaching stories in which the old Kendo master is accosted by a river, by a young swordsman who wants to test his prowess with the old Kendo master. And the old Kendo master knows that he could kill him like this. But he gets in the boat with the young man, ostensibly to fight him, takes him across, and leaves him on the other side. You know, lets the young man get out. He leaves him over there and goes on about his business. And see, in other words, the image is that an immature man would have been so worried about his pride that he would have had to kill the young man to keep from being ashamed. Oh, I've got to kill this young twerp. Whereas the mature Kendo master would never fight somebody like that. If at all possible, would avoid it. And if he had to fight him, he would try not to kill him. See, yes.
It's very much like the character Huai Chang's from Kung Fu, who seemed to be a combination of mages or
yes.
almost equal parts.
Oh, yes. Oh, no question about it. See? Exactly. See, because in the maturation of the warrior, you got to have a lot of magus. Because the magus has got to be there in order to read out these dynamics. You know, to understand what's going on in the young man and what's going on in you. And understand that this young man is waving his sword at you. Come on, big man, I'm going to show you, you know. And the mature man chooses, in fact, in terms of the lore of all this, very often the mature man chooses to love him, not to kill him. Yeah.
I can't help but be reminded of Reagan's attack on Libya and on that island, that little island in Grenada. There's kind of a big bully, played beating up on another kid to show somebody else and you can't stand up to, but instead a bit of an act of Agedosha. And this would be, I think, in direct contradiction to the ethic that I'm talking about.
Well, you know, there are a lot of ways you can look at that. That's certainly one way, and I've heard that a lot. The other thing, though, is the Jimmy Carter version of being president. Slap me again, folks. You know, that is to say, one of the important things to understand is that it's very important for a warrior to be clear that he does have power, that there are situations in which he will use it. Because if there is nothing for which you will kill, then you're not a warrior. See, if there was nothing which you would not kill for, then you're not a warrior. So in other words, yes, it's true that not arbitrarily using force, and certainly against the weak, is important. By the same token, a police officer who is at a grade school playground and somebody comes in to start killing kids, police officer wouldn't use lethal force in that situation. Is not a warrior. See? Yes.
If this type of person, if there's nothing for which they would kill, what are they? It's not like pacifist. I mean, that's the term that's used.
Well, see, the pacifists, the last thing they want to be called is a warrior. And so the point, and that this is sort of the denial of this archetype is very deep in pacifism. Saying, I don't have it, I don't want it, it has no positive purposes. If I could, I would breed it out of the human race by eugenics. It's very important to understand that in this archetype that there is power of life and death. See? Not just life. There is power of life and death. There is the potential use of violence in this archetype. See? And so the question then is what and for what and in what situations would this power be used? See? It's the problem of every police officer. See? Every police officer. In fact, the place to look for the way in which this stuff works out in everyday life is in the life of a Chicago cop. And the king will always use violence to preserve order and justice and so forth in that archetypal motif. Arthur, for example. Look at Arthur. In fact, one of Arthur's problems is that he hesitates too long. And for example, one of the things that you can think about, one of the things I often think about, is what would we have had in the United States with regard to crack if there had been more initiated males in our society? See? Would it be so easy for us to turn aside from the crack phenomenon and what it's doing to children, as we in fact do? Do you know what I'm talking about, crack? Do you know what I'm talking about the epidemic of crack? It's very interesting to see the incredible impotence of our society in the face of something like a scourge like this. Yes.
Robert Blythe talks about an interview he had with a policeman who was mentioned these young boys that he would pick up were various crimes. And the police officer said, not only do these young boys not have an initiated male in their life, they don't even know what one is.
No, they couldn't possibly. They have a fantasy that the dope dealer down the street is one because he kills people. See? He's got all the goodies, he's got all the women, and he's got all the money, and he's got all the guns. And that's where the power is. And so we create, see, what you got to ask yourself about this is what you're doing when you create a society in which the young boys look at that and that's what they see. See, I mean, that is a problem. And it is related to this whole business. Anyway, let's move on now. Let's see. We better take a short break. Let's take about 10 minutes because we got a lot of stuff to cover, okay? And then we'll lay out some of these positive potentials, and we'll do that together. Sure.
How does killing the ego relate to the ego itself?
Yeah. See, when Eastern philosophers or Asian mystics or Buddhist, people influenced by Taoism or Buddhism or often some forms of Hinduism, when they talk about destroying the ego, They don't mean ego like psychoanalysis means ego. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. When they are talking about ego in Eastern philosophy, they're talking about narcissism. So when you destroy the ego in Eastern thought, you're becoming less narcissistic, less arrogant, see, less prideful in a immature way. And that is exactly what happens in psychoanalysis when you have a stronger ego. When you develop the ego-self axis in psychoanalysis or in Jungian thought, you're becoming less narcissistic, less grandiose. So in other words, the terms are used radically differently. And so when he talks about killing the ego, slicing the ego in two with a sword, that's the first stroke. That is destroying the grandiosity. So it's just exactly the flip, just exactly the opposite. Anytime you see, I'm editing a book right now on, entitled Self and Liberation, and it's a comparison of Buddhist thought, and it's got all these essays by Jung and prominent Buddhist thinkers dialoguing around the concept of the self and ego and that sort of thing, and it really turns on this question you ask, the totally different views held by Buddhists and by Jungians. But they're talking about the same thing. They're talking about the liberation of the self from pathological grandiosity. That's really where they are together. See? Yes.
You were talking about the drug dealer on the corner, and I was wondering about three other male images in black culture. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Jesse Jackson, and more with the idea of nothing willing to kill for. And it was sort of Martin Luther King's philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly he was certainly willing to die for things, but the problem with Gandhi's Satyagraha, see, it works with British. It wouldn't have worked with the Southerners. It wasn't Martin Luther King's Satyagraha that did away with the kind of apartheid that existed in the southern United States. It was federal troops with bayonets. That's what did it. I mean, I marched with Martin Luther King in the Montgomery-Selma campaign. If it hadn't been for federal troops, we'd all been dead. Mm-hmm. And so all this nice Satyagraha stuff is fine as long as you're dealing with people that don't like to exploit force upon the bodies of the weak. But if you're dealing, well, if they had it and they had not been corrupted by Nazism, or they had not been corrupted by the military-industrial complex like they were in Japan, but the people that got in control in Nazi Germany and Japan had no real allegiance to any knighthood ideals. They committed atrocities right and left, and the Japanese government to this day does not allow the Japanese people to know anything about the Japanese atrocities. Japanese school children to this day are not taught anything about the extent of the experimentation. We call that's all the Nazis did, all this experimentation on humans. The Japanese did a lot of it too. And so it is a. Now you raised the name of Malcolm X. That's another interesting person in this context, because he was a person that would really embody a lot of the knighthood ideal. And also in a mature way, because it was very interesting, after his trip to Mecca, he was able to slay the dragon of his racism. And it was because he was able to come back and say, Allah is God of all. That got him killed. See? But Malcolm X would have shot back if he'd had a chance. Yeah.
One other masculine ideal came to mind that's quite common, and that's a rock star. He has a phallic symbol.
Oh, yes. He's the archetypal lover, basically. A lot of archetypal lover, a good bit of the megas, sort of the, if you look at somebody like the Rolling Stones, they're a very heavy combination of archetypal lover and archetypal megas. That is, Jaeger and the people conceiving the approach of the Stones had to understand a lot about ritual. In order to really do a rock concert, you've got to be a master magician, see, as well as being waving your wand and your phallus as well, you know. But it's not the warrior. It's not the warrior stuff. But let me go through this white knight, red knight, black knight. You pick up this in a lot of different knighthood traditions. It's very interesting. I just want to go into that. Now, and it's very interesting that it's in this order. And a lot of people say, what? You mean the black knight is the highest form of initiation? How can that possibly be? Well, it has to do with the integration of the shadow. Because when you're the white knight, you're like Lancelot coming into the kingdom saying, oh, I am the pure one. The purest of the pure am I. I would never do anything to harm my Lord, and any king that had me as his knight would be so lucky. I mean, because I am so devout and pure. See? And so he's the white knight. Yes, that's right. But you see, he was not one who would ever have any problem with sexual passion. See? He would not be anyone who would turn aside from his responsibilities because of passion, or would let his passions overwhelm him in any way and cause him to do anything wrong. See? And so this is your real young uninitiated warrior who thinks he's pure. If this is your South African white police lieutenant who is very incensed about these black terrorists that are bombing these white settlers, and therefore feels justified in torturing these suspects, you know, to get the truth out of them so he can protect the innocent from these nasty black terrorists. See? That was portrayed recently in that, what was the name of the film in South Africa about the Cry Freedom. But you see, I'm innocent, you see, and it's amazing. See, study torture. You got to study torture, the whole phenomenology of torture, to get a sense for this, because it's your white knight that is the torturer very often.
Is Lancelot the one who got the woman, or?
Now, he's the one who falls in love with the king's wife. And he is so impressed with his romantic love for the king's wife. I mean, you know, this is the thing about the immature male. When he all of a sudden he's in love with some woman, and his love then takes precedence over everything else. There is nothing that's holy. See? And this is where Robert Bly has come out. I was very interested. I hadn't talked with Robert Bly about this particular issue. But when Robert Bly is talking about no mature man will ever have an affair with another man's wife, this is what he's talking about. He is pointing to this particular aspect of the fidelity ideal of a mature man. See? Because the white knight, see, he is the innocent one. He would never do it anyway. This is your psychotherapist who brags that he would never have anything to do with any of his clients. You know, I would never exploit my professional trust. You know, look out.
What's the positive side of the white?
Well, it is that concern for purity. It is that concern to be unsullied. I mean, that is not a bad thing. I mean, it is a part of that sense of honor. And it's a part of that sense of idealism that, you know, they talk about the puer having good side of the puer being his idealism. Well, this is kind of what they're getting at. It's like, you know, you ought not to have to feel like a boy to wish that the cops were not corrupt. See? I mean, you shouldn't have to somehow feel less than a man because you don't like it that the cops are on the take. And that's the white knight, see, in a sense. Yes?
It doesn't sound like it's grounded in any kind of
reality. It's not.
there's no spirituality. It's a purity that is really not pure.
No, that's right. It's grandiosity is what it is. You see, he's inflated, but he doesn't know it. You see, he doesn't. It's the classic Jungian thing about not knowing your shadow. You don't really know. See, everybody else has got one, but not me. See, I mean, I am not vulnerable. See, there's the classic blind side. Once you get into this I am not vulnerable business, you've been had. You've been had then, yes.
So isn't he like the totally innocent knight or Parsifal?
Yeah. It's this bogus innocence. He's not innocent. See, but in his conscious mind, he's innocent. Yeah, he just doesn't think he would ever be a problem to anybody.
How come Parsifal can unseat the Red Knight, who's more sophisticated?
Well, it's because of who he is. I mean, this is a sense of calling. This is calling. You got to understand all this in the light of vocatio, calling. I mean, if you're the right person, in this case, the right man, I mean, you're going to be able to do all kinds of things. But see, the red knight, here we get, see, the red knight in most of the traditions is an image of the person that has discovered passion. And I don't mean just sexual passion, although in the thing about Lancelot, it's presented as sexual passion. But it's passion, and in the context of most warrior functioning, you would say this is rage. Rage. And, of course, this is and you're still a little bit on the white side, see. Yes, I know I took my nightstick and I beat you up, but you needed it so bad. You richly deserved it. In fact, if I'd really given you what you deserved, I would have beat you a lot longer. And listen, there are a lot of cops that feel that way and do it. Well, just to be righteous, you see. I mean, the police departments of our country are full of this kind of abuse. It's not just the Australian cops. You know, if you're an Australian Aborigine, you have this uncontrollable urge to suicide when you're put in a prison in Australia. Did you know that? Did you read about that lately? There's just this compulsive urge to suicide if you're an Australian Aborigine. They put you in a cell and all of a sudden you just have to strangle yourself. Must be hereditary. The Australians are saying that they think that this must be a problem that comes from their religion, and they've lost their religion, and now they get into the cell and all of a sudden they have to die. They can't stand the loneliness.
Aren't they also one of the few cultures that still have male initiation?
Yeah. The Australian Aborigines have male initiation, but a lot of the Australians don't. If you've ever been to Australia, you know, I mean, all of the classic, Crocodile Dundee, you know, there's a lot of this pseudo-macho stuff in that kind of culture, but they're killing a lot of these Australian Aborigines because they have the audacity to talk back. And it's very much the same type of thing in these, in jails, you know, a prisoner, you talk back, you get killed. And you hanged yourself in the cell. And that happens all over the world. And it is the whole thing about torture. Torturers are not bad folks, see? They're just punishing these bad folks, see? And they're doing it in the name of right. And I just was overwhelmed by my righteous indignation toward you. And that's why I had to hook you up to that machine.
Is that the whole kind of mentality and driving forth?
Yes, sir. They were knights. Those were Dominicanes, dogs of the Lord, hounds of heaven. We were trying to help you out with your soul, and I just had this passionate urge for your salvation, see? And there is no sense of the shadow there, you see? And what you get here, this is what happened a lot in Vietnam. Well, they killed my buddy, and now we know where that fire came from, that village. And we're going to take out that village. And if you read the Vietnam literature and the accounts of what our soldiers did in Vietnam, you get a lot of red night phenomena. And that is where you are passionate, righteously, about killing thoroughly. See? I mean, thoroughly. Yes.
You know, now that you mentioned it, I'm saying they talk about that some provisions was to become what they call double worthies. They try to with the original, whatever the original, they would kill it.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. See, was very common in Vietnam. And a lot of it is related to what has happened in terms of the officer corps. You have that kind of business, you have no officer corps. What you've really got is a bunch of puers playing officers. And you had it all the way up in terms of the generals. I blamed the officer corps for this kind of business because that could have stopped a lot of that stuff. A lot of it was very organized, very upfront. And not only did they didn't just shoot women. I mean, a lot of the time they experimented with them with their shovels, and it was done all in righteousness, you know, because they were gooks that had killed our buddies. See, so there is purity here and passion here, but it's still pure, and there's no shadow yet. See, you're running into the rage. This is where you get all the, and happens in relationships. You talk about where this comes out in relationships. You get a lot of red night in relationships. And female night, too. A lot of people that feel like they are justified in rageful behavior with their partner. And you try to get in there and try to intervene against this rage, and this righteous indignation, what are you talking about? I mean, I have the right. I mean, this, you know, I've got to stand up for, you know, I've got to stand up for me, you know. And there is no sense about rage as a puer phenomenon. And there's no sense of the difference between anger and rage. See, anger is under ego controls. Rage is not under ego controls, and rage is what leads to domestic violence. See? And it's what leads to cops killing kids unnecessarily, or people they're arresting. What? Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. And, it is the person who has got the lethal force, the right to use lethal force, but they do not have the personality to be able to deal with it. And this is what all the police academies, see, this stuff is what all the police academies have to teach, and they don't well. They try, but they don't do it well. Yes.
Example was in the film Colors, where Robert Duvall is one type of knight and the other class, Sean Penn, is exactly what that.
Yeah, that's right.
That is.
That's right. That's right. And Duvall gets killed. But that's the point. See, a knight would rather die 1,000,000 times than go against the code under which he is sworn to operate. And that's, I think that is a good film to look at for that. If you look at Colors, you'll see that difference. And you see it a lot. I don't know whether you've ever done any street work much, but there was a time when I was a community organizer in the city here. And I was out on the street a good bit with people, and I came to really admire a lot of Chicago's finest, because I have seen them stay sane in situations where if they weren't really in this, they would have been shooting people. So you hear about the cases where the cops shoot people, but you don't hear about the hundreds and thousands of cases where they absorb incredible abuse and they maintain their presence of mind. They use necessary force, not unnecessary force. It is, oh yes, precisely. And but the tendency is for us to hear about the cases where it's abused.
What would be the beneficial aspect of that?
Well, the important thing is passion. See, I mean, it's not necessary to be immature to have passion, contrary to what some people think.
An example of this in the Arthurian cycle.
That's a different kind of image. Well, in that Arthurian thing, the Red Knight doesn't come out through the violence; it comes out through the sexual passion with Guinevere. It's the same type of thing, though. It's where the passions overwhelm the capacity for commitment and for honor. The Black Knight, then, is very clearly the man who has dealt with the shadow, and he knows that he cannot take a position of righteous indignation and simplistic moral blaming, and cannot run his functioning on that basis, that it is not his own, in other words, it's not my personal honor that's really at issue here. It is a much wider code, and that the fact of whether somebody is saying shameful things to me, see, I've dealt with my own self, you see. The issue is I've dealt with myself, and because somebody says humiliating things to me, I don't have to shoot them. See? Whereas a person who has not dealt with their own narcissistic issues in the shadow, they will not be able to stand being talked to in a ridiculing way. And that's, again, you're right about the Sean Penn character, and the Sean Penn, blows. But the Black Knight thing is an image of the integration of the shadow, the realization that, yeah, if I had been in your shoes, kid, I probably would have done what you did too. See? And that is to say, it's that thing about nothing human is alien to me. It'd be something like this. You have in you the capacity to be a mass murderer, given the right set of conditions. And so don't get too self-righteous about Bundy. See? And for example, those people that say, gee, I'd love to pull the plug myself. Well, I understand that. However, it wouldn't be because I would not think that there would be conditions in which I could have done that. And the same thing is true in terms of all these situations with atrocities and all that sort of thing. Human beings are not to blame in some simplistic moral way. There's so many forces that are operating. But the question is, how do I exercise my power in this situation? And for whom? And in this sword stuff, it is not for my personal ego, my personal narcissism. It is one's power is exercised under a code of commitment and for a wider good. That's sort of the knighthood ideal. Yes.
So this movement toward balance also. I mean, that if there's opposite stuff in the white knight, the red knight, the black knight, but it all has to be balanced. I mean, it has to be an equal.
Well, what you get in the Black Knight is someone who is, you might say that his magus has come much more online. That is, the Merlin, the inner Merlin now is very much with him and whispering in his ear and saying, there but by the grace of God go you. So don't get so cocky about this. Just do your job, Yes.
Could you also talk about how that's connected with creativity?
Yes. Well, the person that can't get to this doesn't get any creative energies, but the person that gets to this is a better steward of them. Because, we hear so much about the person whose creativity and his passion is so wonderful and so overwhelming that he just can't be responsible in any way. He's just the wonderful creative artist, and he just, it's just art flowing through him. And just his art is so powerful that it just causes us to overlook all of the rest of his personality. Well, this level would suggest that a man can be creative without being a sociopath. There's a lot of mythology about this, You got to be a sociopath if you're really creative, You got to have nothing that stands between you and your passion. Well, that's what this is about. So let's talk now a little bit now. We've got a few minutes left. Let's summarize some of these virtues. And let's just list warrior virtues. Put up as many as we can. This is fine. And let's just list them. Things which this archetypal configuration offers in potentia, which are not the shadow side. Let's leave the shadow side of it till next week. Loyalty. Yeah, and fidelity.
Discipline, commitment to an aim.
And what was the last one? Commitment to what? And I would say commitment not just to an end, commitment to a transpersonal end. Cannot be commitment to your career. If it's commitment to your career, that's not it. You know, all this rap about professionalism back in the 19th century when professionalism rose as a cultural form, it had this sense. Professionalism was not commitment to your career. Professionalism and careerism were not the same thing. It has become to the point that professionalism just means careerism today, but it wasn't that way at first. So it's transpersonal. I think that that it is experienced as sacred, and may be for the person very sacred. It may be grounded in some transpersonal, may be grounded in some metaphysical value, religious value, spiritual value. But it cannot be just personal. That's the point. It cannot be just my ambition. Because if it's just my ambition, it's just self-serving. See, in other words, by definition, a mercenary is not a knight. See, in that sense.
And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with self-serving?
Nothing wrong with it. It's just not a knighthood ideal. It's just not the warrior ideal. Well, I mean, I think it's important to serve oneself in many ways, too. The lover does that a lot. See, the archetypal lover is really into enjoyment. And it's not into doing. This is Action Jackson here. I mean, this is capacity to act. Now, next week we'll really get into what's the big deal about that. Well, the fact is, people have a terrible time acting on anything. They'll study it. They'll ruminate about it, preferably obsess about it, you know, all sorts of things. But in terms of acting, that's different. And this is the archetype that allows you to act. In George S. Patton's word, attack, attack, attack. See? You don't dig any foxholes. That's in Patton's. See? And that's a sort of a metaphor. See? Oh, of course, always. See, you've got to remember, in terms of archetypal psychology, you don't want any of these things in their pure form. You get them in their pure form, you got a dangerous person without commitments to anything. See?
Maybe they're pure loyalty, pure fidelity, pure discipline, pure...
Well, pure loyalty is what? Fanaticism. Ayatollah Khomeini, I am 12 years old. I will go die for you on the fields of Iraq. You know, I mean, this partisan zealotry, you know, it's the Nazi party ideal, you know. I mean, you know, you're not very critical either, see, because if you don't have any megas, you don't think about this dude you're committed to. See, if you're a human being, you got to be able to decide whether you're going to be committed to him or not. Are you going to continue being a part of the British Empire, or are you going to have an American Revolution? I mean, it's a question of whose loyalty, who's going to be the one that you pledge your fealty to? And is there anything that that person could do to say, I unpledge my fealty?
In addition to the warrior archetype and the lover and the magnet, it seems so important, the king archetype. And I'm wondering if it's weird, it's like, I realize the warrior, magnet, lover in us. Is the king archetype in us, or in actuality, like you talked last week, is it the sacred king? Is it the true order? Is it, you know, if you want to say our creator who put the archetypes in us?
That's a theological question, which you have to deal with yourself. Everybody has to deal. You just because you do the psychology, it doesn't mean that you finished the theology. You do the psychology, then you got to deal with the metaphysical and theological question. And I'm not depreciating that. I'm just saying that in terms of the psyche, these things have got to be balanced, and you're absolutely right to point it out. And remember this. Always remember when you're dealing with any archetype. We'll talk next time. We'll really get into this a lot more about the way in which not enough presence of the king will manifest with this. Not enough presence of the lover will manifest with this. Not enough presence of the magus will manifest in certain ways. Okay, but what else? See, to act, to organize, to plan, to resource. Sorry about that. One of the things when the warrior archetype really goes mad, and it's not regulated, you've got all of your tank divisions out here strung out, and you run out of gas. There you've got all your tanks sitting along on the plain, no gasoline. Now, I want you to think about that as an image for things that happen in your life. Does that ever happen to you? When you've been too much in the warrior and you hadn't bothered to check the gas gauge? Right, checking the gauge. Yes. Well, you always improvise. A warrior always improvises. See, that's an obsessive compulsive. I mean, one of the things that happens is, another thing it does, look at this one. Anesthesia. It knocks out the pain. You don't feel it. This archetype doesn't feel pain too much. It's one of the most dangerous things about it.
Emotional and psychological. We're allowed that.
Not when you are really in it.
Doesn't he need to acknowledge that? Doesn't the warrior need to acknowledge?
Right, as a human. See, but when you get in trouble with this thing, we'll see the next week, talk about the compulsive. When you get in trouble with this thing, whereas if you're in some other archetype, you may feel tired when you're tired. But if you're in this one, you won't feel that tired when you're tired.
Distinguishing between the wounds that Ben carried and the warrior acknowledges his wound. It's the macho type that doesn't acknowledge.
That's right. That's right.
And takes that wound and inflicts it on another person.
That's right. Well, but you see, what you got to see is the way in which that's built into this archetype.
Which is
The not feeling the pain. The wound that Bly talks about, warrior's not going to pay attention to that. When you're really into that warrior archetype, when you're possessed by it, you can be shot all pieces and not feel it.
What is the archetype that does acknowledge the wound?
Well, you also, the magus is going to know it. The lover is sure going to know it. But see, this thing doesn't exist to make you aware of your wounds. This thing exists to help you inflict wounds on the enemy. And so another thing, and we've got to stop here in a minute, but look at this. On this one, finding the enemy.
Discrimination.
Yeah, it is. Well, that's discrimination, which is very closely related to the same thing. You can look at a lot of problems, which we'll get into next week. A lot of problems in personality exist because a person is not aware there's an enemy. I mean, there are a lot of things that are real enemies, and the person not aware of it.
And that's the source of denial.
That's denial.
And naivety.
Yeah. And so it's this warrior archetype is going to make you vigilant. See, And so think about now the relationship between this archetype and paranoia. See? See? So, next week we'll talk about how it's working in paranoia. See, because all you got in paranoia is this thing working. It's just doing its thing.
With no discrimination.
With not enough discrimination. And remember, the archetype always will have an enemy. It's not, if not, it'll invent one. But the thing about it is, human beings always have an enemy. The problem with humans is, though, they keep thinking it's other humans. We'll stop there for a minute.
Are you interested in discovering if you truly embody the essence of the warrior in his fullness, or if you are influenced by its more shadowy aspects? Why not take the Masculine Archetypes test? It's absolutely free and can guide you on a path of self-exploration. By gaining a deeper understanding of your masculine energies, you'll uncover your strengths and identify areas where you can grow. Don't miss out on this opportunity to embark on a journey of self-discovery. Take the Masculine Test today at www.masculinetest.com.